All right, so to remind you where we left off at the end of last week, we talked about two different approaches to increasing upward mobility. One is a moving to opportunity approach in light of the fact that we see these very sharp differences across local neighborhoods in kids' chances of doing well. One strategy you can take is to try to help kids from low-income families move to higher opportunity areas. And then the second strategy, recognizing that it's hard to move everyone, is a place-based investment approach trying to increase opportunity in areas that were in the red colors on the maps we've been looking at, which currently have lower levels of upward mobility. So today we're going to continue talking about these two approaches, starting with the moving to opportunity approach, where you'll remember at the end of the last lecture, we talked about randomized experimental methods as a way to evaluate whether a given intervention or a given policy works. And we talked about how you set up a randomized experiment, how you deal with issues of non-compliance, and so forth. So kind of the basic methodology that underlies what I'm going to talk about now in this lecture, which is the moving to opportunity experiment. So the moving to opportunity experiment is a very famous experiment in social science. It's one of the rare cases where we were able to test a hypothesis by actually conducting a true scientific randomized experiment. Usually, as we've discussed, that's very hard to do in the social sciences. And so in this case, this was implemented in the Clinton administration by the Housing and Urban Development Agency from 1994 to 1998 in 5 major cities in the United States: Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, LA, and New York. And the way this experiment worked is that they took 4,600 families, and those families were randomly assigned. Essentially, think of it as flipping a coin, assigning them to one of 3 different groups. The first is what they call the experimental group. This is kind of the group where they were trying to test something new. And so what they did with this group is they offered them housing vouchers. So think of this as like rental assistance worth something like $10,000 a year, about $1,000 a month. It varies depending upon which city you're living in and how many kids you have and things like that. But you know, it's a fairly significant sum of money to be able to rent a house or an apartment. And in that experimental group, you received this housing voucher, but it came with the restriction that that voucher had to be used in a low poverty census tract. That is a census tract with less than a 10% poverty rate. So why did they place this restriction? You'll know from some of the research we talked about in the earlier lectures that one of the strong predictors of differences in upward mobility across places is poverty rates. Places with very high concentrations of poverty tend to offer worse outcomes for kids growing up in low-income families. And so this was an effort to basically get low-income families to move to more mixed-income neighborhoods. Okay, so that was the experimental group. They received vouchers with that restriction. Now, the second group is the Section 8 voucher group. This group was offered conventional housing vouchers. So by that I mean housing vouchers that were worth the same exact amount as the experimental group. But importantly, that group faced no restrictions in where those vouchers could be used. They could rent an apartment wherever they wanted. It didn't have to be a low poverty place. It could be a high poverty place. You could choose wherever you found an apartment. And then the third group was a control group that was not offered a voucher and simply had the option of staying in public housing. And so to think about what this group, what their options were, the way this experiment worked is that all of these families that they selected, the 4,600 families, were initially living in very high poverty, very large public housing projects. So this is the way you would think about a traditional public housing project in the United States. Think of a huge apartment building, typically in a place like New York, thousands of apartments, very concentrated high poverty areas, often not the best living conditions. And basically, these families in the control group, just through pure chance, they didn't get one of these vouchers. They simply had the option to remain in those relatively high poverty public housing projects. Okay, so they flipped a coin, assigned the families to these 3 groups. As we talked about in the last lecture, not everybody complies with the treatment. So in particular, 48% of families assigned to the experimental voucher group actually used the voucher to move to a new place in a low-poverty census tract. And 66% of the Section 8 group actually ended up using the voucher to lease a place. So 1/3 of the people who got the voucher, they didn't end up finding a place that they wanted to rent, even with that assistance. They ended up staying in the higher poverty public housing projects. So to give you a concrete sense of how this experiment is playing out in reality in the data, let me focus on one of the cities where it was implemented, New York, and just give you a concrete sense of the places we're talking about. So they took a bunch of families starting out in what are called the MLK Towers in Harlem, very high poverty public housing project. It's a tough neighborhood that people would recognize, and those housing projects still exist in Harlem. And then, so the control group basically, think of them as their kids grew up in that area. Then you've got the Section 8 group. Those families could move wherever they wanted. Typically, they moved to a place called Soundview in the Bronx, which is about 6 miles away from Harlem. And then the experimental group, remember, they had to move to these lower poverty areas. They again moved to a variety of different places. The most common place to which they moved was a place called Wakefield in the North Bronx. That's about 10 miles away from the MLK Towers. So these are really short distance moves, in the grand scheme of things. You're talking about people moving a few miles away from where they were before. And fundamentally, you can think about this experiment as asking what happened to the kids who grew up in these different neighborhoods, what happened to the adults who were living in these different places. Can we compare their outcomes? What can we learn? Does this sort of policy of helping people move to opportunity actually work? Okay, so as you can imagine, there was a lot of excitement about being able to do this type of intervention. People thought it could really provide a pathway out of poverty that would be scalable. And in fact, the Moving to Opportunity experiment was designed in part in collaboration with my colleague here at Harvard, Larry Katz, in the economics department, and a number of other prominent social scientists in the 1990s. And after the experiment was implemented, there have been probably 100 or nearly 200 papers written about this experiment, evaluating its impacts on numerous different dimensions, from economic outcomes like earnings and employment rates, to health outcomes, to social outcomes, lots of different things. And by and large, somewhat, I think quite disappointingly for the people working on these issues, the early research on moving to opportunity in the late 1990s and the 2000s that Larry Katz, Jeff Liebman, who's at the Harvard Kennedy School, Jeff Kling, a number of others conducted, really found quite disappointing results. It found very little impact of moving to a better area on economic outcomes such as earnings or employment rates. And as a result of that, people I think were kind of confused or weren't sure how to proceed, because intuitively a lot of people had the sense that neighborhood environments really matter. But this gold standard scientific experiment seemed to suggest that it didn't really have a big effect, right? Which also seems to contradict a lot of what I've been showing you in the past couple of lectures. So, how do you reconcile that experimental evidence with the broader intuition that neighborhoods matter, with the types of stuff we were talking about in the last lecture and so forth? So it turns out when you look back at the data, the earlier studies focused primarily on adults and on kids who moved at older ages. And why did they do that? Because if you think about kids who were like 5 years old in 1996 when they moved to a different neighborhood, and you were doing an evaluation in, say, 2000 or 2005, and you were trying to look at outcomes like earnings or college attendance rates or employment, the kids who moved when they were very young were just not old enough to be able to observe those outcomes, right? So very naturally, if you're going to do an evaluation, you're going to tend to focus on the people for whom you have data, who are going to be the adults who are working and you can directly look at their outcomes, and the older youth for whom you can measure things relatively early in their careers. So when we came back to these issues with Nathan Hendren, another one of my colleagues here in the economics department, we talked about in the last lecture our quasi-experimental study, where we look at kids who move at different ages, remember, to different neighborhoods. We looked at those 3 million families that moved from one neighborhood to another. And the key finding from that work was that the earlier you move to a better area, the bigger an impact it has, right? And so when we had that result and we convinced ourselves using the quasi-experimental approach that it really seemed like neighborhoods matter, naturally we wanted to go back to the moving to opportunity data and try to understand how our findings fit with the prior experimental work, which seemed to suggest that neighborhoods didn't matter. And we had a very simple hypothesis, it's a very intuitive one, which is that maybe the earlier studies didn't find an effect because they didn't look at kids who were young enough. That is, if you looked for what we call childhood exposure effects, that is, look at impacts proportional to how long a child was exposed to a better environment, maybe you would start to see stronger impacts, right? And so, we essentially go back to these data and ask a very simple question. Does the MTO experiment, the moving to opportunity approach, improve outcomes for children who moved particularly when they were very young? And so the way we analyze that question is now, becoming like a standard big data sort of approach. The traditional way to do it would be to continue to survey the participants in the moving to opportunity study. But that's an incredibly costly thing to do, to track down all of these families and their kids year after year. And in fact, the Housing and Urban Development Agency that commissioned this study basically issued a final report around 2013 where they did their final analysis and they said, it really looks like this thing doesn't seem to have significant economic impacts. There are some gains in terms of health and so forth, but on the economic front, this really doesn't seem to work, and we're not going to continue tracking these people. So what we did instead is we took the data from HUD on the moving to opportunity participants and linked that to tax records, the information that we talked about in the previous lectures. And by doing that, we were able to follow the younger children over a much longer period, right? You don't need to go back and do these surveys. You just systematically see everyone in the tax data. And so what we're then able to do is just a standard experimental evaluation, comparing earnings across groups, adjusting for compliance rates, and importantly, doing that analysis by the age of the child at the point in which they were involved in the experiment. Okay, so let me show you what we find with a series of charts that look like this. And so let me explain what we're doing here. It's really quite simple. So remember, there are the three different groups, right, to which people were randomly assigned: control, Section 8, and experimental voucher. What we're doing in this first chart is looking at kids who moved when they were relatively young. That is, kids who were below the age of 13 at the point that they were randomly assigned to one of these three groups, all right? And in the chart on the left, we're looking at their earnings in their mid-20s, above age 24, typically around age 26, 27, something like that. And on the right, we're looking at college attendance rates. Now, the way the bars are constructed is that the gray bar on the left is for the control group. These are the folks who stayed in the public housing projects. That first bar just plots the average earnings for people in the control group. So it's just a simple mean, okay? And so the mean for the control group here, the mean earnings is $11,270, okay? So this is, obviously a very low number. It's an incredibly disadvantaged population that's receiving these housing vouchers, and they're growing up in these very high poverty areas. So that reflects the fact that, you don't see great outcomes, very high rates of upward mobility in this population on average. So now the next bar is the Section 8 bar. What we're doing there is basically plotting the earnings that you see in the Section 8 group, adjusting for the fact that the compliance rate is not 100%. Okay, so if everybody in the Section 8 group took up the voucher, all we would need to do is just plot the average earnings in the Section 8 group. But it's not quite that simple, because remember, only 2/3 of the people who were assigned the Section 8 voucher actually used it to move to a better neighborhood. So in order to figure out what the earnings are for the people who actually moved, we do the following calculation. We take the average earnings that we see in the Section 8 group minus the average earnings that you see in the control group. So that difference, is, call it something like $1,200. And then we divide that by 0.66, by 2/3, to inflate the gain in the way that we talked about in the last lecture to figure out what the treatment effect is for the people who actually moved. And then finally, we add that back to the control group mean in order to figure out what the earnings level is for the people who actually moved with the Section 8 voucher. Okay, so think of this as just average earnings for the people who received that Section 8 voucher, adjusting for the difference in adjusting for the fact that only 2/3 of them took advantage of that voucher, all right? And so what you can see there is that the average earnings for that group is about $13,000 as opposed to $11,270 in the control. And then finally, in the experimental voucher group, we do the same analysis, again adjusting for the compliance rate, and compute the average earnings for those folks. And that's closer to $15,000, okay? So what you can see here is that there's a very clear difference in the earnings in adulthood for the kids who, through pure chance, got assigned to the experimental group relative to Section 8 group, relative to the control group. These p-values that you see here that's just a way of saying what is the chance that these differences occur just purely due to random variation as opposed to a real difference in the effects. So the logic of this, for those of you who haven't done like a statistics hypothesis test, that's what this is reflecting. The idea is that if I look at any two groups, suppose I just divide this classroom into two and I compare average outcomes like GPAs or something like that, I'm going to see some difference in terms of average outcomes just because of pure chance, right? The set of students who happen to be in one of the groups versus another group. So in any two groups, you're going to see some variation just due to random variability. The question we want to ask here is the difference that we're seeing statistically significant in the sense that if we had an infinite amount of data so that we eliminate all the random variation just because of who happens to be in one group versus another, would we continue to see a difference between those two groups? And the p-value, you can think of it as measuring the chance that we saw the difference that we're seeing of about $3,500 purely just due to random variation as opposed to a true difference in the underlying outcomes between the two groups. So this p-value of 0.01 that you see here means that there's about a 1% chance that this was just due to random noise, and 99% chance in some sense that it's actually a real effect. Okay, so we're fairly confident based on this experimental analysis that there is a real gain from being assigned the experimental voucher, moving to opportunity relative to staying in the control areas. Now, how big is that effect? In a percentage sense, it's actually quite a large increase in earnings, right? It's about a 30% increase in earnings relative to the base that you see in the control group. On the other hand, you might look at it from the perspective of you're still earning only $15,000 a year. It's not like you've reached the middle class or the upper middle class or something like that. So, at some level, I think what this shows is you can bring people out of extreme poverty to some extent with the moving to opportunity approach. And in order to achieve bigger gains, you might need to do more than that. You might need to find even better neighborhoods to which they can move, or you might need other types of programs on top of that that will truly transform kids' outcomes, or it might take multiple generations and so forth. But leaving that aside, it's clear from this evidence that for kids who were relatively young at the point of the move, there's a pretty significant effect of moving to opportunity on their later earnings. Now, likewise, if you look at college attendance rates, you see that in the control group, only 16.5% of these kids went to college, 18% in the Section 8 group, nearly 22% in the experimental group, constructed in the same way as how I described the earnings chart. So on that dimension as well, you see significant progress simply from this, giving these families these vouchers. Let me show you a couple other outcomes. So you can look at other things beyond earnings and college attendance. On the left bar chart here, we're looking at the neighborhoods in which the kids themselves live as adults. So this is a measure of the poverty rate in the zip code where the kids who were involved in this experiment are living in adulthood. And you can see that the kids who were in the experimental group are living in lower poverty neighborhoods themselves when they're adults. Why is that useful to note? It means that their own kids in the next generation, so the grandkids of the parents who were involved in the Moving to Opportunity study, they also are going to be growing up in better neighborhoods now. So you kind of do this intervention once, it benefits the kids in the next generation, and then it will benefit their own kids in the following generation because they themselves are growing up in better areas. So it will have long-lasting payoffs. And then, looking at yet another outcome, if you look at the fraction of women who go on to become single mothers, that's 33% in the control group, 31% in the Section 8 group, down to 23% in the experimental voucher group. So you've also got more kids in the next generation being raised in two-parent families. You've got different, perhaps more stable family structures, things like that, that also, at least we've seen in a correlational sense, are associated with better outcomes in communities. So on a wide variety of dimensions, it really seems like the moving to opportunity intervention actually does work in quite a significant way in improving outcomes for kids who were young. Now, in contrast, if I now repeat that analysis for kids who were older, right, between the ages of 13 and 18 at the point of random assignment, you see a very different picture. You see a picture that's consistent with the traditional evidence that people had found. So here, if you look at this group of kids, you actually see that the earnings of the kids who were in the Section 8 and experimental voucher groups are slightly lower than those in the control group. So if your family moved to this different neighborhood when you were 15 years old, it doesn't seem to benefit you, and if anything, it actually seems to be slightly detrimental. Now, that difference there, notice the p-values here, they're more like 0.25. So that means like there's a 25% chance that this difference is just due to who randomly happened to be in the experimental group versus the control group. So we can't be super confident that there's really a negative effect. So we don't necessarily know that there was a negative effect, but what I think we can say pretty clearly is that there's not a large positive effect. There certainly is not as big a positive effect as we saw for the younger kids. And likewise, when you look at another outcome we looked at, fraction single moms, it clearly doesn't go down. If anything, it looks like it slightly goes up in the experimental group relative to the control group. Okay, so this is very consistent with the pattern that we were seeing, with the prior evidence that there's little impact for the older youth. And then one final piece, if you do the same analysis now, looking at the adults, so looking at the parents who were involved in this experiment, look at how their earnings changed depending upon which group they were assigned to. Here you see that there's, again, absolutely no effect. There's no evidence of a gain that you see an increase in earnings when the parents move to opportunity. You only see the gains for kids who moved when they were very young. All right? So any questions on this before I move on and tie this back to other things we've talked about? Yeah. Yeah, good question. So typically these kids would have gone to a different school. So the moves were far enough that they ended up going to different schools. An interesting question is how much of the effects we're seeing are because they went to different schools versus other differences in the neighborhood environments in which they were growing up. And I think we don't know for sure, but our sense is it's some combination of the two things. So there's some work that Roland Fryer has done with Larry Katz, suggesting that the quality of the schools to which children moved in the experimental sample weren't actually that much better than the control group schools, which suggests that it's not all about school quality. And that's consistent with other evidence as well, which I had talked about earlier, that you see sharp differences in outcomes even among kids who attend the same school, right? So if you look at two census tracts that are part of the same school district, often you still see quite substantial differences in rates of upward mobility. So I think part of it is probably about schools, but all of it is definitely not about schools. Yeah?
Were earnings adjusted for other increases in cost of living? For example, I'm from the New York City area, and actually going back up north to the Bronx, it would take forever to get to work if you worked in Manhattan or worked in Brooklyn. It would be actually a huge
cost.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. So great question. I mean, I think what that gets to is for the adults, it's not actually clear that it's that beneficial for them because you can see right here, This is just straight earnings, not adjusted for any cost of living, transportation cost, anything like that. And even without that adjustment, it's clear that they're not gaining when they're moving up to the Bronx. Then when you take the factors you raise into account, it's probably going to look even worse for the adults. But if you come back to the kids, right, and the young kids, the thing that I was showing you here, there, the way I would think about it is those children are not necessarily living in the North Bronx in adulthood, right? Like kids move around relative to their parents. And there, you know, I think they're living in better neighborhoods, they have higher earnings, they possibly are not paying. We don't think that adjusting for transportation costs and things like that would change this picture significantly. So I think what that underscores is that I think about these moving to opportunity policies as really like an investment for the next generation. The current generation doesn't necessarily benefit that much and could even pay a price perhaps, but there are significant gains to be had for future generations. Others? Yeah. Yeah, good eye in picking that up. So it's 15,000 here for the kids. So the question basically is why is the gray bar here in the control group at 15,000 when we're looking at the kids between the ages of 13 to 18? Whereas if you think back to the below 13 graph I was showing you before, it was down at 11,000, right? So why do we see that difference? It's actually a very simple reason. We're measuring kids' earnings around 2012. And so if earnings go up as kids get older, right? And so if you think about the kids who were older in 1996, we're going to be measuring these kids' incomes, you know, more like in their early 30s, and the other kids' incomes more like in their mid-20s. So that's the reason you see that difference. Yeah. And sorry, just say that you said the value of P is extremely high? Yeah. Yeah. Yep. So, you know, you see some really high p-values here. So the way I would think about that is there are two distinct issues to worry about. So you use the word bias. So the way to think about bias is, am I systematically off one way or the other because the two groups might not be comparable? And so in an experiment, the nice thing about an experiment is we don't think and you know, there's a formal definition of this in statistics, we don't think these estimates are biased in the sense that because we've randomly assigned people to these different groups, they're going to be comparable to each other. However, in any small sample, we may randomly see some differences between one group and another because it just so happens that somebody did really well in one group or didn't do really well in another group, right? And so what the p-value is capturing is how should we think of these differences as really being driven by true differences in the underlying means in these two populations, or just this random chance that you had a few more people of one type versus another type in these groups. And so you're right that some of the p-values here are really high, right? Which basically is telling you odds are this is just a random variation. It's not like the 40.2% is really deeply different from the 41.4%. Another way to say it is if I were to do the experiment again, there's a good chance that it would flip the other way in the next experiment if the p-value is really high. And so that's exactly why I say that for the kids who were older, we don't really know that there's a significant difference across these different groups. However, if you think about the kids who were younger, right, like think about these p-values, they're like below 1%, what that's saying is if I were to repeat the experiment 100 times, it's extremely unlikely that I'm going to get a different conclusion when I keep redoing the experiment. So we put weight on the cases where we see very low p-values as being significant findings, and then the other ones we think are non-important differences. Does that help? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So where I think we have the most confidence is that the experimental voucher really has an impact relative to the control group. You're absolutely right that for the section 8, it's less clear. There is a systematic pattern that the section 8 seems to be between the experimental and the control, which you would have seen in many of these charts. I'm going to come back to explain why I think that's the case. But you're right, just strictly comparing section 8 to control, you don't have a ton of confidence. So you're getting at an important issue that you don't have a lot of statistical precision in these experiments, and I'm going to come to that in a second. Anybody else? Yeah, please.
For the difference for the kids between 13 and 18,
yeah.
do you see the same trend regardless of gender?
Yeah, good question. So are there gender differences? So here, I mean, you don't, and this actually interacts with the previous question. Once you start cutting the data into subgroups, you know, you're cutting it by age, looking at older kids, and then you're looking at boys versus girls, you start to run out of statistical precision a little bit, so it's hard to tell. We didn't find a ton of gender differences. There is some literature suggesting that moves, especially in adolescence, are more disruptive for boys than for girls. I think this experiment doesn't quite have enough data to really pick that out cleanly, but it's a plausible hypothesis for sure.
Is part of the reason why a slight majority of people did not actually use the experimental voucher because HUD only provided the money, like they didn't help with other aspects?
Yeah, so you're getting at actually some work we're doing right now with HUD to address exactly that issue. So HUD provided the money, they did provide some support, but I think a lot of families found it hard to find housing in those places. And also remember, the landlords have to want to rent their apartments to you, right? It's a two-sided market. And a lot of landlords don't necessarily want to rent their apartments to people who have Section 8 vouchers. So I'll talk about how in our ongoing work, we're trying to address exactly those issues. Okay, so let me press ahead, and I'll stop again to take some more questions in a little bit. Okay, so the questions you've been raising actually touch upon a number of the things that I want to talk about next. So the first thing you might ask, so I've shown you this randomized experimental evidence. We kind of think of this as the gold standard approach, that moving to opportunity, especially for younger kids, really does seem to have quite significant impacts. So you might then ask, okay, that's great, but let's come back then to the methodological issues for a minute. Why don't we just use randomized experiments to answer all policy questions? Why do we bother with any of the other methodologies? Like, why did we spend time in the last lecture talking about the quasi-experimental approach? Or why are we going to talk about lots of different methods in this class? Like, why don't we just do an experiment in every case? So one simple answer is that this was really unusual that they were actually able to do an experiment. It's very hard typically to get Congress, you know, they had to authorize this demonstration. Getting people to agree to be involved in an experiment is pretty hard because, you know, assigning things through a random lottery, people view that as unfair. Why did I get it and you didn't get it? Just because if you flipped a coin, it came out one way versus another, et cetera. But beyond that simple limitation of feasibility, my view is that even if you could run an experiment for every single question you wanted to answer, it is not clear that you'd actually want to answer all questions in that way. And that's because of, I think, 3 common limitations that affect randomized experiments. The first problem, which is a classic problem that people have thought a lot about in statistics, is what's called attrition. So as you could see with the moving to opportunity experiment, it was critical to look something like 20 years after the experiment was initially implemented to really pick up its effects, right? You have to be incredibly patient. If you had tried to evaluate the impacts of the experiment 5 years out, 10 years out, as people did, you would have ended up concluding the thing didn't really seem to work very well. Now, the problem when you're trying to do such a long-term follow-up is that you tend to lose track of people over time, right? So long-term impact evaluation becomes very unreliable. And why is that the case? You know, people move around. Actually, if you think about the moving to opportunity case, it's precisely about helping people move to different places. And if you're going to send them a survey or call them or go try to find them, it's going to become increasingly hard to do that, especially over time. And so you get this problem of attrition where your sample is becoming smaller and smaller over time. And that is especially problematic when the rate of attrition starts to differ between the treatment group and the control group. Because if that happens, now you've lost the beauty of the randomized experiment, which is you had this kind of apples to apples comparison between these different sets of people. So suppose whoever's in the treatment group, they start to do really well, and as a result, it's easier to track them down through, standard methods. And so you're able to follow a big part of that group, but then the control group is really not doing well, and lots of people, maybe end up incarcerated or who knows what else, and you lose track of lots of folks that way. Now you're going to have two groups that are not really comparable to each other, and that's going to create bias in your estimates. So this was a huge problem with experimental methods in the past. As you could see in the way I described how we went back to the moving to opportunity experiment, the big data revolution of using administrative data sets essentially allows us to fix this problem in many cases. So in particular, in the context of moving to opportunity, we were actually able to track 99% of the participants in the experiment 20 years earlier by linking the MTO HUD data to the tax data. So you like almost perfectly fix that problem, which is a remarkable advantage of modern data sets. But in other contexts, especially in developing countries, attrition bias is still a central thing to think about. Second, coming to the question that was asked about these p-values being high, and are these estimates really precise? Can we really conclude that there are significant effects here? As you could see, we have, the experiment in some sense is a big experiment. It involves 4,600 families. But still, at the end of the day, 4,600 families is not an enormous sample. It's not like the millions of kids that we were studying in some of the earlier work we were talking about. And so what that does is it makes the estimates imprecise. And I mean imprecise in the sense that if I compute an average, over 3 people, it could be high, it could be low, just depending upon what one or two, one of the people happen to do. If I compute an average over 10,000 people, it's going to be much more precise. It's going to be much more stable if I took repeated samples of 10,000 people, right? And so in experiments, when you have relatively small samples, especially when you're looking at long-term impacts, you start to get more imprecise estimates. And critically, unlike the attrition problem that I just described, that problem is not fixed by the big data revolution. That is not going to be fixed by modern technology. The way I think about it is the cost of data is falling very rapidly in the world, right? That's one of the major trends that kind of underlies this. It's basically the genesis of this class. But the cost of experimentation, especially in social science, has not. In fact, I think the cost of experimentation has actually gone up over time because you worry about more things. You have to pay people more to participate in experiments, things like that. So it's not going to become cheap to run experiments with millions of people of this type, anytime soon. And so the result of those small sample sizes, the lack of precision, is illustrated by this chart here. Okay, so what I'm doing here now is plotting the experimental versus control means versus the age of the child at the point that they were involved in the experiment, okay? And so this is basically a different way to show you the data that I was just showing you in the bar charts in the previous few slides, where you can see that for the kids who moved, who were 10 at the point of the experiment, they gained about $2,000 on average. This, by the way, is not adjusting for the compliance rates. That's why that number is a little bit different from the 3,500 in the initial bar chart. And so then we do that again for kids who moved around age 12, 14, 16. And you see a declining pattern here, but these estimates are very imprecise. And the way that we can see that is we construct what's called a confidence interval, shown by these dashed gray lines. And the way you interpret that confidence interval is that it gives you a sense of the plausible range of estimates you might get if you were to rerun the experiment. In particular, this is called a 95% confidence interval, which means that if we were to repeat the experiment 100 times, 95 out of 100 times, the estimates we get will lie between these two dashed lines. Okay, and we'll talk more in this section about how we construct confidence intervals, but it's basically a way to think about how precise your estimates are. Now, the key thing I want to point out is that these confidence intervals, this is very related to the questions that were asked earlier, they are quite wide, right? So the gain, we can see that the gain is positive here for kids who moved when they were young, right? Because the bottom of the confidence interval is still above 0. But the magnitude of the gain could be anywhere from something like $100 up to $3,800 or something like that. And then if you look at how wide the confidence intervals get down here, we see smaller impacts for kids who move at older ages. But again, the potential range of estimates is extremely broad, okay? So that is a serious challenge with experiments. The fundamental reason for this is that we have only 4,600 families here. If we had 4 million families, those gray lines would become much, much tighter, and we would have tremendous precision in mapping out these estimates. So to give you, as a contrast, think back to the chart that I showed you in the previous lecture, which you'll recognize is basically the same pattern, right? Qualitatively, it's showing you the same declining effect that we saw on the previous slide. But this was coming from the quasi-experimental design that we talked about, where I gave you the example of people moving from Roxbury to Savin Hill, 2 different neighborhoods in Boston. More broadly, we look at people who move across different neighborhoods in the US at different ages. And what you can see just by looking at the dots here is that this is incredibly more precise than what I was showing you from the moving to opportunity data. And the reason for that is extremely simple. There are 3 million people underlying this chart, and there are 4,000 people underlying this chart, right? And so when you have 1,000 times as much data, you're going to get a lot more precision. If you were to overlay confidence intervals on these estimates, they would basically be the width of those dots that you're seeing on the plot itself. So they're like extremely small, so you have a lot of confidence in what these estimates look like, okay? And so that's the second reason that I think you can't simply appeal to experiments. You always will have a benefit when you're using quasi-experimental methods or other types of just ways of using the large observational data in getting a more precise sense of what's going on. Okay, the third factor that matters here is generalizability. So remember, the moving to opportunity experiment was conducted in only 5 cities, right? In some specific set of neighborhoods, like in New York, from Harlem to a handful of other places. And so a very natural concern is that you did an experiment in one place. How do you know it's going to generalize to some other city with different conditions? How do you know it's going to generalize to a different demographic group, maybe different racial mix, different characteristics? And there is no guarantee, actually, that it's going to work the same way in other contexts. And that is a difficult problem to address with pure experimental methodologies. It's actually related to your question about gender as well. It's difficult to run experiments in all subgroups and all areas and have enough precision. And so as a result, scaling up purely from experimental data can be quite challenging. So that's why at the end of the day, I view experiments as being a really useful complement to other methods that you will learn in this class. Okay, so now just to make, think about the converse of this. So quasi-experimental methods using big data can address some of the limitations that I just laid out, right? So the study of the 3 million families that moved across areas that we just talked about a minute ago, how does that work? So fundamentally, the logic of that study is similar to the experiment. So in an experiment, the way we achieve comparability across groups is through random assignment by flipping a coin. In the quasi-experiment, similarly, we need to have some way to basically achieve comparability across the groups that we're studying. Now, if we just look at people who choose to move to different places, they're not going to be comparable to each other, right? So if I just take a set of people, let's say, in Harlem in New York, and I compare the people who chose to move to the Bronx versus the people who chose to move to some other place, they may be comparable, they may not be comparable. Odds are they're probably different types of people who are moving to different places, right? So that would probably not be a very good approach to trying to identify the causal effect of growing up in different areas. However, the idea that we use in that quasi-experimental paper that I talked about is that people who move when their children are younger versus older to the same place are maybe more likely to be comparable to each other. So if you and I both moved from Harlem to the Bronx, but you moved there when you were 7 and I moved there when I was 9, you know, maybe it's more plausible that our families are actually pretty similar to each other. We have similar characteristics. If we look at a big enough sample, we are kind of comparing apples to apples. Now again, there's no guarantee that that is true. And you'll remember from the last lecture, we did various things to try to evaluate the plausibility of that assumption. We compared siblings within the same family. We talked about placebo tests using variation across genders and things like that. But the point I want to make here is the way to think about quasi-experiments is that essentially what we're doing is approximating experimental conditions by comparing children who move to a new area at different ages. So it's like the same idea, like at a conceptual level as the experiment. We want to achieve comparability, but rather than doing that by flipping a coin, we do that by making what we call an identification assumption, an assumption that seems reasonable and that we can defend, right? So there are some assumptions you can make that are probably not reasonable. Like suppose I was just to split this class into the people sitting on the left side of the classroom and people sitting on the right side of the classroom. And I compare those two groups. Like maybe those two groups are comparable, maybe they're not. It could be that there are more freshmen on the left and more sophomores on the right, and people are not comparable to each other, right? So it's not, it depends upon the type of assumption that you're making. And if you make an assumption like we did there about the age of the move being unrelated to kids' potential outcomes, you know, it's possible that you'll be able to get traction with the quasi-experimental approach. Now, what is the advantage of taking that approach? You'll be able to use quasi-experimental methods in, I think, a much broader range of settings than running a new experiment. And in doing so, you'll be able to address some of the limitations of the MTO experiment, right? So in particular, much larger samples, as I've pointed out, yield much more precise estimates of these childhood exposure effects. So in particular, every year you spend growing up in a better area, we see a 4% convergence roughly to the outcomes of the kids in the place to which you moved. So if you move to a place where kids are growing up to earn about $10,000 more on average, every extra year that you spend growing up there, you close about 4% of that $10,000 gap. And then second, because we're able to do that quasi-experimental analysis for the entire United States, for all different subgroups, we're able to run the analysis separately for black kids and white kids and boys and girls. We're able to show that the findings are very generalizable. So, you know, in the context of the question you asked about gender, we're able to show that boys who move to better areas at younger ages do significantly better, as do girls in the quasi-experimental approach. Now, what is the limitation of the quasi-experimental approach? It relies on a stronger assumption, right? You have to believe the assumption that I made that the kids who move at younger and older ages are comparable to each other. Whereas with a randomized experiment, all you have to believe is that I flipped the coin properly, which is obviously like a weaker assumption. You're more likely to believe that. And so the bottom line, I think, is that as in a lot of scientific research, the way you do this is by building a case. It's reassuring to have evidence from multiple different approaches, and especially if they point in the same direction, you start to develop a consensus on what is actually going on. And you know, what's very nice about having worked on this topic in the past few years is that is exactly what has happened. There's a clear consensus that I think has emerged among social scientists in light of this recent research, that moving to opportunity is an approach that actually works in helping kids rise out of poverty. And that's based not just on the 2 studies that I just described here, but it turns out that since we put out our paper, Nathan and I, using the US data, there are now a series of other such papers showing exactly the same thing in a variety of other settings. So this is in Australia, in Denmark, in Canada. We talked about the moving to opportunity stuff. Totally different approach using public housing demolitions in a paper by a guy named Eric Chin in Chicago, again shows a very similar pattern. So, you know, you start to see this in so many different settings. It has now become kind of a widely held view that these childhood exposure effects, the earlier you move to a better area, you really see systematic improvements in kids' long-term outcomes. Okay? Questions before I move on? Yeah.
Were there any factors that consistently saw a higher rate of convergence
The 4% is remarkably stable. I mean, we're amazed by how constant it is. If you actually look at these graphs in detail, you can see that even across different countries, if we look across different groups and so forth, you really systematically see something, you know, if it's not exactly 4%, it's 3.5%, something like that. It's amazingly stable. Yeah. Yeah.
So if this theory is true, and then you take it to the logical extreme of we should move all low-income families
Yeah.
into better neighborhoods,
Yeah.
then my assumption would be that the measurement of that neighborhood being better, if we're basing it off of
Yeah.
income, would not hold true
Yep.
anymore.
Yep.
So how do you explain away that sort of like logical fallacy?
Yeah. Yeah, excellent question. I mean, so the way to think about these experiments, what we're doing here is just moving one person, right? And we're saying that that has an effect. Now, you're absolutely right that if you start to do this on scale, it doesn't seem plausible that you would end up seeing the same effects, right? So fundamentally, when we say moving to a better neighborhood, we don't think that it's like something fixed about the neighborhood, like the soil or something in that area that's producing better outcomes. We think it's probably about the composition of the people living there and the institutions and so forth. And so I'm going to come to this in a little bit. My view on this is moving to opportunity can be a plausible approach at a smaller scale, but it's not likely to be a scalable approach because of what economists would call general equilibrium effects, that if you have large changes in society or in the economy, you will change the equilibrium itself and end up having a very different set of outcomes than if you do what we call a partial equilibrium analysis, where we kind of hold everything else fixed and change one person's behavior. So this is just, think of it as like, in a small scale, we've demonstrated this works, and then that's going to motivate why we need to think about other approaches to complement what we're doing here. Okay? Okay, so in that vein, so what can we, what does all this research actually mean for housing voucher policy in terms of actually trying to improve people's outcomes? Okay, so I think what we learned from this is that housing vouchers can in fact be very effective in helping families rise out of poverty, but they have to be targeted very carefully. So first of all, what you should be able to see from the charts that I just showed you is that it's critical to target affordable housing at families with young kids. And if you think about what current US policy does, it's unfortunately like exactly the reverse of that. So what we tend to do is put families on wait lists when they have a kid to get a housing voucher. And often those wait lists can be incredibly long. Sometimes they can be as long as 10 years, okay? And so if you think about what's gonna happen there, families get on the wait list, when their kids are relatively young. They finally get to move when their kids are older, exactly when it has less benefit. And so you're in an equilibrium where you're spending $22 billion a year on Section 8 housing vouchers, but actually not really helping anyone because of how the system is designed. So that is obviously not a good approach. And as a result of this type of evidence, there are a number of housing authorities around the US that are shifting the priority ordering on their wait lists to give families with young kids priority. Okay, so that's like a very concrete, simple thing that you can do that can potentially increase the efficacy of these programs. Second, I think it's very important to explicitly design these policies to help families move to affordable, high opportunity areas. So you will notice, and you picked up on this, that in the MTO experiment, the unrestricted Section 8 vouchers actually produce smaller gains for the kids, even though families could have gone to exactly the same neighborhoods that the families who got the experimental vouchers ended up going to. Okay, so let me say that differently. In the context of New York, you had these families that started out in Harlem, right? The families that got the Section 8 voucher, they could have gone anywhere they could find an apartment in New York. They ended up going to places like Soundview. They did not go to places like Wakefield. But they could have gone to Wakefield if they wanted to, right? They had exactly the same financial assistance as the people who ended up going to Wakefield and were in the experimental group. So in some sense, the experimental group was a strictly worse offer than the Section 8 unrestricted voucher, because you could have done the same thing as what the experimental people did. You just weren't forced to move to the low poverty area. So from an economic point of view, economists would usually say if we give people more choices, we should see better outcomes, right? Because people will maximize and do the best thing. You know, if they want to maximize their kids' outcomes, they're going to figure that out. And they will move to the place that will lead to the best outcomes for their kids. So from that point of view, it's kind of surprising, actually, that the more restrictive experimental option delivers better outcomes for children than the less restrictive Section 8 option. Another piece of evidence that kind of goes in that line is if you give people cash, basically this comes back to the poll question we asked in the last lecture. If we give people $10,000 of cash rather than a $10,000 housing voucher, we see that they rarely use that cash to move to better neighborhoods. And in fact, there's little evidence that those cash transfers actually lead to improvements in their kids' outcomes, okay? And so, you know, all of that challenges traditional economic theory, which, as I was saying in the previous lecture, predicts that giving people a cash equivalent of a housing voucher has always got to be better than giving them the housing voucher itself. Because people don't, for whatever reason, actually end up using that cash to do things that, in the most systematic way, will improve their kids' outcomes. So if your goal is to improve upward mobility for children, it actually seems like providing housing vouchers and specifically designing those housing voucher policies in a way that encourages families to move to higher opportunity areas is incredibly important. Now, this is especially the case because it turns out that something like 80% of the 2.1 million vouchers that are issued by the US government each year are currently used in very high poverty, low opportunity neighborhoods. So let me give you an example of that looking at data here in Seattle, where we're doing some ongoing work, which I'm going to describe in a second. So what we're doing here is just taking a screenshot of the Opportunity Atlas in Seattle, standard statistic that you're used to seeing, usual coloring and so forth. And the dots here represent the most common census tracts where families with housing vouchers in Seattle currently live. And what you'll see is a very clear pattern, which is that these dots tend to be clustered in the red and orange areas of the map, not the green and blue areas of the map, right? They're clustered in the lower opportunity places where kids are actually not going to have great outcomes, right? So at some level, the housing voucher policy is almost perpetuating poverty across generations rather than you know, reducing it because of where families are ending up using these housing vouchers. Now, this is true not just in the context of housing voucher policy, it's also true in the context of other affordable housing policies in the United States. So just to give you another example of that, another major policy in the US is called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. We spend about $6 billion a year giving developers tax credits for building affordable housing. They've got to keep rents below a certain threshold and make them affordable to low-income families. Where are those affordable housing developments being built? They're heavily concentrated in the red-colored parts of the map, not the blue-colored parts of the map. So, you know, you might worry that the low-income housing tax credit, while well-intentioned, is actually reducing mobility out of poverty across generations rather than solving the problem, okay? So in light of that, you know, a simple question you might ask and a problem you might try to tackle is to ask, you know, why don't more low-income families move to opportunity, right? Why are people using these vouchers, using this money they're getting from the government to stay in relatively low opportunity areas? Presumably they care about their kids, they want to achieve better outcomes, why aren't they doing that? So what's the most simple economic explanation that you would think of? You know, perhaps it's that areas that offer better opportunity are just unaffordable. So the places that offer better outcomes for kids, you know, they're the places maybe with better schools, lower crime, things like that. Those places are going to be more expensive neighborhoods. Maybe families would like to live in those places, but they just can't afford them with their housing vouchers. So that's a very natural explanation to start with. We can test that explanation, and we can do so by examining the relationship between the measures of upward mobility that we've constructed and data on rents that we can get readily from the census or from websites like Zillow and so forth. And so that's what we're doing here. So what we're doing is plotting think of this as basically the price of buying opportunity for your children in Seattle. Each dot here represents a different census tract or a different neighborhood in Seattle, right? And the vertical axis is the data from the map, the measures of upward mobility, where do kids end up on average in the income distribution, conditional on growing up in a low-income family. The horizontal axis now is median two-bedroom rent in that neighborhood, okay, in 2015. And so what you see here is that there is an upward sloping relationship, as you might expect intuitively. Places that are more expensive, on average, tend to have a little better outcomes for kids. But there's a tremendous amount of dispersion around that line. So in particular, those of you who are familiar with Seattle, some of the highest opportunity areas you saw on the map, they're east of the lake. They're places like Bellevue. Those are places like where Bill Gates lives, very expensive areas. Obviously, that's going to be quite unaffordable for a family receiving a housing voucher. So those would be like the dots that are out here, right? But the point is, while these dots, these outlier places are very good for children, you don't need to go to Bellevue in order to achieve good outcomes for your kids. In fact, if you take a place like the Central District, which is where a lot of families with housing vouchers in Seattle currently live, you see quite poor outcomes there, as we saw on the map. But it turns out you can move to a place like Normandy Park, which is actually less expensive than the Central District, but produces dramatically better outcomes for children. So here you see average earnings in adulthood for kids who grow up in the Central District, something like $29,000 a year. If they were to grow up in Normandy Park, that looks more like $42,000 a year. So quite a substantial change, and you would not actually have to pay more money to rent an apartment in Normandy Park. You would actually be able to afford that with the housing voucher as it is, okay? And so that, creates the possibility that perhaps we could use these data that we've constructed to help families move to these opportunity bargain places. And in fact, that is something that we're doing at the moment in Seattle. And I'm going to turn to describe that pilot study, that experiment that we're running in the field in a second. But before I do that, I want to make one final technical point that some of you might be wondering about. So effectively, what we're going to do is take the maps that we've constructed in the Opportunity Atlas, identify these opportunity bargain places in the way that I just showed you, and help families move to those areas. So before we go do that, and we're actually, there are now hundreds of children who are moving in Seattle as a result of exactly, the logic that I was just describing. One thing you might worry about is this practical concern that the data on upward mobility that I've been showing you are necessarily historical data, right? Because you have to wait until kids grow up to actually measure their earnings in adulthood. And so you might worry that these Opportunity Atlas estimates, they're based on kids born in the early 1980s who grew up in the 1990s and 2000s. But of course, if we're helping kids move today, you would worry that, is it actually the case that Normandy Park is still a high opportunity area for children who are 5 or 10 years old today? Because that's what matters from a policy point of view. So are the historical estimates useful predictors of opportunity for children who are growing up in these neighborhoods now? This is an extremely important question from a practical point of view. So when we started working with the Seattle Housing Authority on designing these policies that I'm going to describe in a second, this was the #1 question that they were worried about. Naturally, as you all probably know, Seattle is a city that has changed a lot in the past 20 years with Amazon and things like that, a lot of gentrification. So are these historical estimates still relevant? So this is, I think, actually quite an important area for research going forward. I'll show you one piece of evidence that illustrates how you can get a sense of this and why we were reassured in moving forward. So what we're doing here is basically evaluating the stability of the estimates of upward mobility over time. And so the way to think about this chart is, suppose I construct the maps that I showed you for kids born in 1980. And then I ask, suppose I now construct the map for kids born in 1981, and I correlate those two sets of estimates. I ask, how similar do those two maps look, okay? So that gives me some number. That's the number that's at 1 here, okay? We're going to benchmark that at 100%. So now, instead of using data from so let me flip it around. So suppose I'm trying to predict what outcomes look like for kids born in 1990. And suppose I use data that's 1 year old. I use data from kids born in 1989. And I get some predictive power. So now, suppose I repeat that exercise and I ask, I'm not going to use data that's 1 year old, I'm going to use data that's 2 years old for kids born in 1988, or 1987, or 1986. So I use more and more historical data. How much worse do my predictions become? That's what this plot is showing you, okay? So if you have a benchmark of 100% when you use data that's 1 year old, that decays to like 97% when you're, or 98% when you're 2 years old, and so forth and so on. And so it's getting worse and worse over time, which makes sense, right? That reflects the fact that as you use older and older data, the quality of your predictions is going to decay. But importantly, notice that you're still at like 90% accuracy, even when you're 10 or 11 years out, right? So the point is, places change, but on average, the historical data is still a pretty informative predictor. Now, by no means is it perfect, and so what we ended up doing in Seattle is used more recent school district data to look at how test scores were changing and things like that to try to build basically a better prediction model, and we'll talk more about those kinds of techniques later in the class. But for now, the point I want to make is it's not like these upward mobility measures change dramatically over even a 10 or possibly 20-year period, which is why we use the Opportunity Atlas as a starting point for the interventions that I'm going to describe. Okay, and so what we do in light of all this evidence is we've started what we're calling the Creating Moves to Opportunity pilot in Seattle, where we're helping families with housing vouchers move to high opportunity areas in Seattle using 3 approaches. And this comes back to the question you were asking about, we do more than just giving people cash. So we're doing 3 things that I think of as kind of tackling 3 different issues you'd worry about. So first, do people actually know that Normandy Park produces really good outcomes for their kids and could be a place to look at? Often we find when we ask families, especially low-income families, these are really disadvantaged populations. Many of these people are coming out of homelessness and things like that, a lot of adversity. So the traditional kind of economic idea that they have visited every neighborhood and have a perfect sense of which place is going to be best, I think is a bit strained, honestly. And so providing information in a way that's thoughtful and saying, here's somebody who moved to this neighborhood and actually had a pretty good experience, that is one aspect of what we're doing. On the other side of the market, Seattle is a very hot housing market. Landlords can rent their apartment to 5 different people. Their view is often, why do I want to deal with the housing authority and all the inspections and regulation, whatever that comes with this? So we have simplified that part of the process and tried to make it much more attractive for landlords to rent their apartments to these tenants. And then finally, we connect kind of the supply and demand side of the market by offering housing search assistance. So the way I think about this is at the high end of the income distribution, if you think about buying a house, there's a big market there. There are lots of people who want to be your broker, and they'll charge you a fee for that. At the low end of the market, because there isn't that much money, people don't have brokers, and so we're effectively offering assistance, people who will help you find housing in a place where you'd like to live, all right? And so importantly, the way to think about these interventions is that they're incredibly low cost relative to the cost of the vouchers. So the vouchers are $10,000 a year. Over, a family could use that voucher over 10, 15 years. It would add up to like $150,000, something like that, that the government is spending. Okay, everyone, so we're gonna continue talking about economic opportunity and wrap up on differences across neighborhoods today, and then turn to the next part of the class, which will be about historical trends in children's chances of achieving the American dream and international comparisons. So just to remind you where we left off, at the end of the lecture before Sean Donovan's guest lecture, we were talking about moving to opportunity approaches to helping kids do better, right? So motivated by the idea that there are these very sharp differences across neighborhoods and kids' outcomes, thinking about a simple policy of helping people move to better neighborhoods, and we talked about the Creating Moves to Opportunity pilot that we're running to help give families access to better neighborhoods and so forth. And so all of that suggests that that is a viable approach to increasing economic opportunity in the United States and increasing upward mobility, and I expect that the government is likely to scale up those sorts of programs going forward. However, I think there are some important potential concerns that you might have about the moving to opportunity approach, and I want to talk through each of those and then talk about why we have to think about alternative strategies as well, rather than just relying on this one approach to trying to solve the problem. So the first thing that you might think of is just cost, just fiscal cost, the types of issues that Sean was emphasizing in his role, being in the government, of what types of programs can you actually scale up and support. And so here, I think a key consideration to keep in mind is when we think about the cost of a program from the government's perspective, we should think about it not just in terms of the initial outlay that we have to pay for housing vouchers that we give these families, which cost a substantial sum of money, right? We're spending about, as I mentioned, $20 billion a year on housing choice vouchers in the United States. But importantly, we have to also recognize that the impacts that these programs have could end up benefiting taxpayers down the road by changing children's outcomes. And so to make that concrete, in this chart here, we're going back to the moving to opportunity experimental data that we talked about a couple lectures ago, where remember there are 3 groups that were randomly assigned: people in the control group who stayed in high poverty public housing projects, people who received the conventional Section 8 housing vouchers, and people who received the experimental vouchers, which were vouchers that you had to use to move to a low poverty, high opportunity area. And before, we showed that for the kids who moved at young ages, those who were randomly assigned to the experimental group had higher levels of earnings, higher levels of college attendance rates, and so forth. And so what we're showing here is how all of those changes in kids' later outcomes end up benefiting the average American taxpayer. In particular, what we're showing is the average income tax that each of these kids pay in these 3 different groups. And you can see that on average, even at age, in their mid-20s, kids who are in the experimental group are paying about $400 more per year in terms of income taxes than the kids who were in the control group. And that number is only going to grow over time as these kids start to earn more and more later on in their lives. And so if you think about adding that up over their lifetimes, that's going to add up to something like, something on the order of a $10,000 or $20,000 increase in income tax revenue per child who got the experimental voucher instead of staying in the high poverty public housing project. And so what that shows is that an important part of the cost that the government and taxpayers pay up front to fund these vouchers actually gets offset by later increased tax revenues. And importantly, that's just one component of the gains that society might get from these kids doing better. They pay more taxes, but they're also, they have lower incarceration rates. They might, depend less on the welfare system and things like that. So there are going to be other ways in which you're paying lower social costs as well. And so in this particular case, we end up showing in this paper that the incremental cost of providing vouchers relative to having a family in traditional public housing is actually negative. That is, taxpayers in the long run will actually save money from this program because they'll end up benefiting more down the road than the upfront outlay. Now, of course, that's not going to be true for every program. Programs that pay for themselves are incredibly attractive because they both benefit the families that you're trying to help, and they also end up saving taxpayers money. So it's sort of like a win-win. It's a no-brainer that we should be trying to implement those programs. And in this case, comparing vouchers to public housing, that does seem like that sort of situation. More generally, there might be other moving to opportunity sort of policies where you're giving tax credits to developers in different places, or you're trying to change zoning regulations or something like that. There's no guarantee that all of those things are going to pay for themselves, but what this shows you is that the downstream impacts can be big enough that when you think about the costs, you want to take those subsequent benefits into account. That really makes a significant difference. Okay, so my view based on that is that the first concern, that this program is really expensive, is not really, if you look at it in like a bigger picture sense, that's not a reason that you should be worried about the moving to opportunity approach. Okay, second common concern. This actually, I think, is the most important concern from a political point of view. So when you think about moving to opportunity, what are you doing? You're basically integrating communities. You're helping low-income people access neighborhoods where typically you have a larger high-income population. And so often what you will find is, while many people are sympathetic to that sort of approach abstractly, when it comes down to their own kids or their own neighborhoods, you get what people call kind of a not in my own backyard NIMBY sort of phenomenon, where higher income folks are worried, maybe legitimately, that integration could end up actually adversely affecting the outcomes of the rich. So we've shown lots of evidence that low-income kids benefit from living in certain neighborhoods where they have better outcomes, typically more mixed-income neighborhoods. But it could be the case that when you move more low-income kids, help more low-income kids move into such neighborhoods, you end up hurting the middle class and higher income kids who are growing up in those neighborhoods. That's at least a theoretical possibility, right? And so, it's a very interesting, in my view, scientific question, not just a political question, scientific question of whether it's actually the case that one group gets hurt when another benefits, or is it the case that there isn't that sort of negative spillover? So we can evaluate that to some extent by looking at how the outcomes of the rich vary across areas in relation to the outcomes of the poor. So in particular, if you're in an area that's more integrated, where we see better outcomes for low-income kids, do we in fact see worse outcomes for high-income kids or not? You can just look at that in the data to get a sense of how important this is. And what you find empirically is that more integrated cities do not in fact have worse outcomes for the rich on average. So let me illustrate that with one chart. So what we're doing here is a plot similar to one of the early ones I showed in this class, where we're plotting the average income of kids, the income percentile that they reach in their mid-30s, versus their parents' income percentile. So this is upward sloping, as we saw. That reflects the fact that if you're born to a richer family, you tend to do better on average. And now we're showing this data separately for kids who grew up in Salt Lake City and kids who grew up in Charlotte. So you'll remember from the examples that I've given you that Salt Lake City is a city with very high rates of upward mobility for kids growing up in low-income families. And so you see that here, right? Kids growing up like in families at the 25th percentile of the income distribution are doing considerably better than kids who grow up in families at the same level of income in Charlotte. Okay, Charlotte, as we saw, is one of the lowest upward mobility cities in the US. Now, what's interesting about this is we see this big gap at the bottom of the distribution. So low-income kids do much better in Salt Lake City and other cities that are kind of more integrated, et cetera. But if you look at the top, there's actually no difference between Charlotte and Salt Lake City. So if you're growing up in a very affluent family, you see no difference in your outcomes if you're growing up in Charlotte as opposed to Salt Lake City. So in other words, if you grow up in a place where low-income kids seem to do better, it doesn't appear, as this example illustrates, to come at the expense of the rich doing worse. Now, that by itself doesn't necessarily prove that as we create more integration, there couldn't be some adverse impacts on some parts of the population. In particular, you might argue that there are other things about Salt Lake City that are different from Charlotte that benefit both rich and poor kids. So this is not like a pure experimental proof showing that there's no causal effect of integration on higher income kids' outcomes. But it is, I think, a pretty strongly suggestive piece of evidence that integration doesn't necessarily mean, it's like a zero-sum game where when one person gains, the other person has to lose. It appears that there are many cities in America where you have pretty good outcomes for low-income kids that tend to be more integrated, where high-income kids do pretty well as well. And so my view based on that is, while people might reasonably be concerned, at least whatever evidence we have to date suggests that you can have more integration, give more low-income kids access to these better neighborhoods without necessarily generating huge costs for other groups in the economy. Okay, so the third concern, which I do think is actually the most important concern and is the limitation of these moving to opportunity approaches, is a simple limit to scalability. So you clearly can't move everyone from one neighborhood to another and expect to have significant effects. This came up in a question someone asked in an earlier lecture. And I think that intuition is exactly right, that this policy is only going to work at a relatively small scale. If you start moving huge numbers of people, you're going to end up changing the equilibrium in the economy. And it's the neighborhoods that you thought were good places may not end up having the resources or the properties that are currently leading to good outcomes. And so ultimately, what that means is you need to turn to policies that improve low mobility neighborhoods rather than just moving people around. And so that's the next thing we're going to talk about. Remember, we talked about these two different approaches to improving upward mobility in light of the sharp differences across neighborhoods. So we spent a bunch of time talking about moving to opportunity. Now we're going to shift to talking about place-based investments. How can you actually increase upward mobility in low opportunity areas? And what you'll see is, although with the moving to opportunity approach, I was able to go into great depth and talk about a variety of different evidence and current policy solutions and all the different factors that seem to matter. On the place-based investments, as you'll see in the next few slides, we have a little bit of a sense of what types of things to focus on, but the state of scientific knowledge at the moment is pretty limited in terms of what actually works in terms of improving places. And so what I'll show you is basically kind of bring you up to the research frontier. This is the sort of problem that we are working on at the moment in our research group, and lots of other people are working on around the US. But it'll give you a flavor for what types of things seem to matter here. So before I do that, any questions on the moving to opportunity stuff before we move on? Okay, great. So, skipped several slides there. Okay, so as a first step, so let's just step back and ask, what's our goal here? Our goal is to figure out, in some sense, what is the recipe that leads to better outcomes in the blue-colored parts of the maps that we've been looking at, the high opportunity areas, relative to the red-colored parts of the map. As I've mentioned in earlier lectures, it's very hard to figure out what that recipe is. And so the first thing that we can do, just to refresh your memory, is we talked about the key predictors of these differences in mobility across places. And so that kind of gives you a sense of what types of things you might want to focus on in order to increase upward mobility. You can basically ask, what do the blue-colored places on the map seem to be doing that may be associated with better outcomes in those areas? And so we talked about a variety of different factors that were predictive of these differences in mobility. Here I'm summarizing them in a slightly different way, focusing on the factors that matter in particular at a census tract level, at a very local level. So when you look at a variety of different predictive factors, you find that the strongest predictors of these differences are differences in poverty rates. So places that have less concentrated poverty tend to have better outcomes for low-income kids, exactly as I was saying before, more mixed income areas. Second, places with more stable family structures, so a larger share of two-parent families. Third, places with more social capital, so more connections between low and high-income people. You know, as I said before, you know, a place where somebody else might help you out even if you're not doing well. Salt Lake City with the Mormon Church, that sort of thing. And then fourth, as you might expect intuitively, places with better school quality. Okay, so what you can take away from this is that it's not any one thing that really seems to be the definitive predictor of these differences across places. It's a blend of different things. Now, the limitation of this type of correlational analysis is that it gives you a sense of what factors might be associated with these differences in outcomes across places, but it doesn't tell you which of these things actually have a causal effect. So to pick one example, we see that places with more two-parent families have higher rates of mobility. Does that necessarily mean that if we could figure out some policy to change rates of marriage, that would have a causal effect on mobility? No, you don't know that just from that correlation. It could be that the places with more two-parent families have something else that's different about them. Maybe they're less segregated, or they have different types of schools or different types of economies in other ways. So the way I look at this is it kind of gives you a sense of what buckets you should focus on and try to evaluate causal effects, but it doesn't tell you the answer by itself. So what I'm going to talk about is how we and others are going about trying to figure out, starting from these preliminary correlations, what the causal mechanisms actually are. And so the first piece of evidence that's useful, I think, in structuring your thinking on this is to note that all of these correlations hold at an incredibly granular level. So Sean Donovan briefly alluded to this in his talk. I'm going to explain the chart that he showed in more detail. So what we're doing here is the following exercise. We're asking, we know that higher poverty rates are associated with lower rates of upward mobility. That's what we've established in the previous slide. If you just do a simple correlation between rates of upward mobility in your census tract and poverty rates in your census tract, you find a strong negative association. So what we're doing now is asking how that pattern decays spatially. So we know that if you live in a very high poverty area, you tend to have worse outcomes on average. But what if the place next to you, the census tract that's like 0.2 of a mile away or half a mile away, is high poverty? Is that associated with worse outcomes, or is that irrelevant? At what rate does the impact of poverty on a kid's outcomes decay spatially? That is a useful question to study because it gives you a sense of the scale at which you should be trying to tackle this problem. If poverty rates matter at a super local level, then you want to think about policies that vary very locally, whereas if poverty rates matter more at like the metro area level, you'd think about a different set of solutions, okay? So what we're doing in this chart is trying to answer that question. And so let me just explain first the mechanics of how we do this. So we take rates of upward mobility in each census tract, and we ask how correlated are they with with poverty rates in that same census tract, which is denoted by 0, or the census tract that's the next closest one, so that's denoted by 1. So we can take all the census tracts in America and find the next closest census tract, the second closest census tract, the third closest census tract, and so forth, right? Just using GIS software and coding distances between places. And so we're looking at the 10 closest census tracts here, and think of each dot as basically telling you the correlation between poverty rates in that census tract and upward mobility in the original given census tract that's at point 0, okay? So this first number is basically telling you that the correlation between poverty rates in your own census tract and your outcomes is something like minus 0.35, all right? So now if we then look at the census tract that's 1 over, we see that that correlation becomes dramatically lower. In fact, if you look at this whole series here, you see that poverty rates in the neighboring tracts have very little predictive power for your own outcomes, conditional on the poverty rate in your own tract. So that is to say, if the poverty rate in your own tract is something like, let's say, 25%, 25% of people are below the poverty line, if I fix that, and then I ask what happens if the poverty rate in the census tract that's 1 over, or 2 over, or 3 over, goes up or down by 1%, the answer is it's basically irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the poverty rate in your own census tract. Now, one important note in understanding this figure, we have not run separate correlations for each of these different groups, right? What we're actually doing here, it's called a multivariable regression. We are regressing outcomes for kids in a given census tract on the poverty rates in all of the nearby tracts at the same time. And so what does that do? It basically allows you to ask the question, holding fixed the poverty rate in your own tract, what is the impact of a change in the poverty rate in nearby tracts? Which is a different question from saying, if I don't hold fixed the poverty rate in my own tract, and I just correlate upward mobility in my tract with nearby poverty rates, I'm going to find a bigger effect there, because if the tract near me is high poverty, then odds are the tract where I'm living also is high poverty. And so this is saying if you control for the poverty rates in your own tract, then what's nearby doesn't matter. Okay, that's the lesson from this chart. And it's a striking finding because what it's telling you is that environment matters in a very, very local way. Just to give you a sense of scale, so the tract that is the next closest one if you take what's called the centroid of the tract, the middle of that census tract, it's on average 1.9 miles away from where you are within your tract. So we're basically saying that conditions 2 miles away from you, poverty rates 2 miles away from you, are completely irrelevant for your outcomes, given the poverty rates in a radius, immediately surrounding your house. So it's a very, very local phenomenon. Now, what's even more amazing, and this is the chart that Sean had remarked upon, is that before we were doing that at the census tract level, which is the data that you see in the Opportunity Atlas, you could basically download that data and run that regression for yourself using the Opportunity Atlas data that's publicly available. Internally at the Census Bureau, we're able to construct these estimates not just by census tract, but block by block for every block in America. So you can go to an even finer level of geography, right? So think about literally every block down the street, in Cambridge. And then we do the same exact analysis, regressing outcomes in your own block on poverty rates in the same block, the block that's 1 over, the block that's 2 over, 3 over, so forth, for the 200 closest blocks. So we're zooming into a finer level of geography, right? And what you can see here is, here you see a slower decay. That makes sense intuitively, right? It would be weird if the only thing that matters is the poverty rate, like literally next door to your house. You would expect that conditions are going to matter, a little bit further out. But if you look at where this gets close to 0, it's by the time you get to something like the 25th or 30th block, there's basically no effect. And so how far is that? That's a radius of about 0.6 miles. So if I draw a 0.6 mile circle around your house, everything that happens outside that circle basically seems irrelevant in predicting your outcomes. And so that shows you again that when we think about place-based policy, we really need to chop that problem down of the American dream, starting at this incredible national scale, down to very, very fine units and thinking about what matters for kids' outcomes, right? And so Sean's point was that this level of granularity, before we had this sort of data and these methods, was basically impossible to understand, the scale at which this stuff really matters. Okay, so what you learned from that analysis is that we should be focusing at a very, very granular level. And so then the question becomes, what are you actually going to do in these half-mile radius places where you see low levels of opportunity? What kinds of interventions can you implement to try to improve outcomes in those areas? Let me stop for a second to see if people have questions about this analysis. Yeah. Yeah. So good question. So this kind of makes more sense in dense areas, right, where it's well populated in nearby blocks. You will find a similar pattern in rural areas, but naturally the way things are segmented, basically, a given block or a given tract is going to be a physically bigger unit in rural or suburban areas. And so you see a similar decay pattern there, but it's not going to be as tight in terms of absolute miles. Because basically, like, think about New York City, like half a mile away, there's a lot of stuff relative to a rural area. So same qualitative pattern, but think of it as like more gradual in terms of actual distance. Any other questions? Sorry, yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, good question. So let me come back to this first as a way to answer that. So here you have a correlation of like minus 0.35 at the tract level, right? So what this is saying is if you go down to the block level, your own block, you're right, has a correlation of only minus 0.06. If you add up all the coefficients, like add up all of these different effects, you get up to minus 0.22. So, that starts to become a bigger correlation. But especially when you get down to a very, very small geographic unit, you start to have a lot of statistical noise, which is going to make the correlation smaller, right? Because in any one block, some kids happen to do well, some kids don't happen to do well. When you have a lot of statistical noise in the estimates, the correlations will get smaller. And so that's why you shouldn't overthink the magnitudes in these charts. If we just think about simple correlations, leaving out all these other places, with poverty rates in your own tract, you find something like 0.4, 0.5, which are pretty big. In other words, if you were to change poverty rates by 10%, you'd see pretty big impacts on kids' outcomes, like we've been seeing in some of the moving to opportunity stuff. But it's a good question. That's why you see, you're right, like if you look at the absolute magnitudes, they start to look smaller when you go down to the block level. That's because you have more noise in the data, basically. Okay, so what do we actually do in these places? What place-based policies are most effective in increasing upward mobility? Okay, so this is basically the current research frontier. The way I think about this is like, over the past few lectures, you've been learning about where we are in terms of studying upward mobility, and now we've come close to basically the current state of knowledge. And so we're doing a bunch of stuff to try to understand what types of interventions can improve kids' outcomes in lower mobility places. The way I think about this, from kind of a broader perspective is, as many of you will know, there are lots of efforts by local governments, by nonprofits, lots of people who care about these issues in the United States and elsewhere to try to revitalize neighborhoods. The problem is that we have very little systematic evidence to date on which of these programs actually work and which of them don't work. And as a result, we don't have like a systematic body of knowledge on how you should go about improving lower opportunity areas. And so you might ask, people have been doing this kind of work on the ground, community building efforts for decades. Why don't we have systematic evidence on what works and what doesn't? There's a key technical problem that the big data revolution sort of solves. So traditionally, what you find is people will implement an intervention in a given neighborhood. So lots of investment, building new houses, trying to improve the schools, doing lots of things. And then often you will see the neighborhood starts to look much better. Average incomes seem higher, there are lower crime rates, everything looks much better, right? And so typically, people who have undertaken such efforts will, understandably and I think correctly be proud of having significantly changed a neighborhood, completely revitalized a neighborhood. The problem in terms of understanding upward mobility is that we have no idea whether the neighborhood looks better because a bunch of new people moved in, that is, the neighborhood gentrified, higher income people moved in, a different set of people now live there, and so it looks better on average, but maybe you haven't actually helped the people who were living there before, who might have gotten displaced and now live in totally different areas, right? And so conceptually, the key thing you need to do when you're studying place-based policies is to figure out what happened to the people who were there or the kids who were there before you did anything. The problem is we've never had data that allows us to track people longitudinally over time so that we can figure out who was there before we tried to improve the schools or reduce crime or do whatever we did. And so as a result, it's been incredibly difficult to figure out which of these policies are actually helpful for the people living in a given place, as opposed to just creating displacement and improving a given neighborhood, all right? So that being said, there are some efforts that people are undertaking to study these questions. And so what I'm going to describe is how we're trying to tackle that problem at the moment and what types of interventions we're studying. So in our ongoing work in our research team here at Harvard, Opportunity Insights, we're tackling this problem using new data and interventions that build on what we know so far. And so I find a useful framework in thinking about the myriad interventions that you might think about to improve kids' outcomes is kind of a pipeline of opportunity, or think about the life cycle of opportunity from birth to adulthood. Okay, so as kind of a simple organizing framework, we've seen from the evidence that I showed you before that every extra year a kid spends in a better environment seems to improve their long-term outcomes. Your entire kind of path of childhood, environmental conditions throughout childhood seem to matter. And so motivated by that, you can think about it as kind of building a pipeline for economic opportunity, starting from interventions at very early ages, which could be things related to family stability or prenatal care, things like that, to early childhood education. Think about programs like Head Start or various pre-K programs. Then you could think about various programs throughout middle school and high school. We've given one example. Think about trying to develop social capital through mentorship programs like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, things like that. Obviously, many other things in terms of improving the quality of education at that period. And then you can think about a set of things in the college phase, helping people apply to college, access the best colleges. In many colleges, reducing dropout rates is a huge deal, making sure people have the right skill sets necessary to have successful careers and so forth. And then throughout that period, as you try to make improvements on all of these dimensions, and I'll talk about concretely how you might go about doing that in a second, I think it's very important to think about how you actually provide affordable housing as you are doing all this. So one of the challenges you see is as you try to improve a neighborhood on all these dimensions, inevitably more people want to move to that area. That drives up prices. And as a result, the people you were trying to help often can't afford to live there. And so it's very important to think about in tandem as you're implementing all these place-based approaches, how you preserve affordable housing simultaneously, coming back to some of the things we were talking about earlier with the moving to opportunity stuff, okay? So this is not just kind of like a theoretical construct that I've cooked up. People have thought about these kinds of life course approaches to trying to improve kids' outcomes for some time, and perhaps the most famous example of that is the Harlem Children's Zone, which some of you will have heard of. It's a 92-block area in Harlem. It's a program run by Jeff Canada in Harlem, right? They selected 92 blocks between 116th Street and 135th, basically. And in that area, over the past 20 years or so, they have done a really intensive set of interventions throughout the life course, from providing prenatal care to providing support to families while their kids are growing up, to helping you fill out your college applications, to having mentorship programs, completely changing the schools. It's a massive, massive effort that involves lots of investment from philanthropists, government, and so forth. And so concretely, you know, what does it look like? It's things like the quite famous Harlem Children's Zone Promise Academy, which is a school, a charter school they basically developed that you get into by lottery, which provides much more support and, you know, a richer set of services than the traditional schools that these kids were going to. Now, as you all know, Harlem, traditionally in New York, you know, was a very tough neighborhood, very high rates of crime, very high rates of poverty. Over the past 20 years, and many people think in large part due to the efforts of the Harlem Children's Zone, Harlem has completely changed, and you see much, much better outcomes there. And we will talk later in more detail about the Promise Academy impacts. There's a nice study that's been done by Will Dobby and Roland Fryer using a lottery design to look at the kids who randomly got the chance to go to the school versus kids who didn't, and they show how that has quite significant impacts on kids' outcomes. They're more likely to go to college, they have lower teenage birth rates, they have better test scores, and so forth. And so there's some real evidence that this, you know, seems to work. But the issue is that, first of all, it's quite expensive. So their budget is now about $100 million a year. And so the question is, you know, how can you do that on scale throughout the United States? And second, we're not yet sure which aspects of the program are actually critical. Is it the school? Is it the family support that you're providing? Is it the college assistance? Is it, you know, other efforts to reduce crime in the neighborhood? They tried to clean up the neighborhood, you know, change housing and so forth. So it's like a multifaceted, complicated intervention, and we, as a result, don't know exactly what the recipe is for success. So one of the things we're doing is trying to evaluate more precisely these types of interventions, in particular looking at the kids who were growing up there before the Harlem Children's Zone was started, looking at what happened to them depending upon which types of interventions they participated in, and so forth. And that can start to give you an idea of what types of place-based policies actually work. Okay? Now, in addition to the Harlem Children's Zone, there are lots of other things, just to give you, you know, a quick sense of the types of things in the space. So, you know, pick another dimension of this, building social capital. There are lots of programs around the United States that people have developed that I think are quite innovative. So there's a program called Becoming a Man, or Credible Messengers, which are mentoring programs targeted particularly at minority youth, typically men, focused on reducing violence and incarceration rates. They have some nice results from randomized trials showing that those programs have quite significant effects. There's another program called Peer Forward, where older students who've gone to college in a given school, like say seniors, provide support to freshmen and sophomores with college application guidance and support. So they try to take advantage of connections within a school to provide mentoring. Yet another group called the Harmony Project, they've developed some innovative ways to engage very young kids in music, and they show that that changes their cognitive function and greatly improves their reading and math scores and so forth. So the point is, there are numerous things like this, many of which I think are quite promising, and some of which might be scalable because you might be able to do them, at a relatively low cost. And the question basically is which of these things work, and what's kind of the bang for the buck for each of these different programs. And so what we're doing in our group is taking our sense based on all of these different programs of interventions that people have come up with and the limited evidence we have to date, where, as you'll remember, I told you earlier how Charlotte has become really motivated about trying to increase upward mobility in light of the data that we've put out there. So we're identifying some of these neighborhoods in Charlotte that have the lowest rates of upward mobility in the city, and we're taking a combination of the set of interventions that I showed you in the previous slides with this life course kind of approach, and picking 2 or 3 places where we're going to do an intensive set of things for the kids there in collaboration with the city government, and then systematically track outcomes to try to understand which of these things are most effective in changing given places rather than just helping people move across places. Okay, so that gives you a sense of how we're trying to figure this out on the ground. So now, in parallel to that, in parallel to testing new interventions, we're also trying to learn from historical data using quasi-experimental methods to analyze previous place-based policies. And so to give you a sense of how this sort of historical research works, the first step in doing this analysis is to actually construct the data to begin with. So it turns out that the type of data that I've been describing to you, tax records, census records that we have for the recent period, the government actually has that sort of data. The Census Bureau has that data on tapes going back to the 1950s. And so you can digitize those tapes to build a longitudinal data set that will allow us to follow Americans starting with those born in 1954. So you can basically go back 50 years and construct the maps that I've been showing you for the kids born in the 1980s back, an additional 30, 35 years, all right? And so using that data, you can then study the impacts of numerous things that people have done, like the Harlem Children's Zone, what are called Hope 6 demolitions, where HUD invested a tremendous amount of money to demolish a bunch of public housing projects and build better mixed income housing. Enterprise zones, which are tax credits given for certain places to try to develop them, so forth and so on. There are hundreds of such things. And importantly, you can analyze using that historical data what the impacts were on the people who were there before you implemented these interventions. That is, on the prior residents, as I've been emphasizing. That's the critical thing. So specifically, you can ask what types of interventions improve prior residents' outcomes rather than just displacing the low-income people who lived in a given place to a different neighborhood. So this is an enormous project, as you can imagine, trying to construct these data historically, then collect information on all of these different interventions that occurred, and then basically do like a treatment control quasi-experimental design, comparing, for instance, what's a concrete way you could do this? You could take, coming back to this map of Harlem, you could imagine, define this as the treatment group, and then take the places that were just south or just north, and look at the kids who happen to live just outside the boundary versus inside the boundary, and look at what happened to their outcomes using these data, right? And so you could imagine doing that kind of thing across the country for lots of different programs that people have tried in order to build this knowledge base. So that's basically where we are. As you can tell, I don't have answers right now in terms of what specific things we should be doing in different places. That's the #1 question we get from people who want to make a difference. What should I actually do in my community? And this is basically where we are in terms of knowing what might work. We think that different interventions throughout kids' lives might matter. It's a combination of things that, from changing poverty rates to improving schools, and there are a bunch of potentially promising interventions out there, but we don't exactly know what the final solution is. So any questions on this? Yeah.
Has any research yet explored in urban areas the impact of proximity to green spaces?
Proximity to green spaces? Yeah. You know, that's something you could do in a correlational sense with the Opportunity Atlas quite easily, right? And my sense is, it relates to a question someone asked earlier about density. So places that are less dense, that have, say, more green space, do appear to have better outcomes. Whether that's the causal effect of actually having parks versus something else that's different about those less dense spaces, I don't know. But that's another example of something you might be able to evaluate over time, right? That there are efforts to build green space, and of course there's a lot of removal of green space over time in different cities. Using the historical data, you'll be able to tell what impacts that appears to have. So it illustrates the promise of that approach. Anybody else?